Exorcism, a word most people associate with the Catholic Church. But the truth is that most religions, especially the big ones, have some form of exorcism. To purge the believer of a demon, a djinn, or another spiritual entity that might have taken a hold of them. In most cases, we never hear of these rituals, as they happen behind tightly closed doors. If we do hear about them, it's usually because something went very, very wrong, as is the case in today's story. In 2011, a man only known by his first name, Washti, went on a summer holiday in Lebanon, the place he had been born in, but had left with his parents when he was just 5 years old, and they had to move to Berlin, in Germany. On this holiday, he met a young woman, and as he would later recount, they immediately fell madly in love with each other. The young woman's name was Nesma, and when she came to Berlin to marry Washti, she was just 19 years old. They got married shortly after meeting, and Nesma moved to Berlin to be with her husband, leaving behind her family and friends. The only person she knew in Berlin was an aunt that she hadn't seen in many years. Nesma, like Washti, was ambitious. While her husband made his career as an engineer, Nesma wanted to go to university. Her parents-in-law did not look upon this favorably. They wanted Nesma to stay at home and give them grandchildren. But Nesma had other plans. She took a multitude of German lessons at the local schools. She had gotten her high school degree in Lebanon and really wanted to go to university and study something in the field of technology. But this would never come to pass. After 2 years of marriage, Nesma's parents-in-law intensified the pressure for a grandchild. And as far as we know, both Nesma and Washti agreed that the time to have a child had come. Another 2 years would pass, but Nesma didn't get pregnant. So the two went to a number of doctors to figure out why. They even made multiple appointments in a clinic that had specialized in fertility issues. But none of the doctors could find a physical reason as to why Nesma couldn't get pregnant. Biologically, everything was fine with Nesma and Washti. At this point, Nesma's in-laws had enough of the waiting. They didn't believe a doctor could help the couple. They thought Nesma was possessed by a djinn. They contacted a hotja from their local mosque. When I looked up what a hotja was online, it said he was a teacher of Islam. But in the court files, the hotja, by the name of Mason, actually described himself as a miracle healer. The hotja told them being possessed by a djinn left women unable to get pregnant. He talked to Nesma and came to the conclusion that she was, in fact, possessed by a djinn. He told her in-laws this was nothing to worry about. He had exorcised djinns out of women that couldn't get pregnant before. He promised them as soon as the djinn was gone, Nesma would get pregnant. All Nesma had to do was drink salt water, and he would come by and pray over her. After 1 week of this, the evil spirit would leave her body. Later, all four, Nesma's in-laws, the hotja, and her husband, all said Nesma willingly went along with this. And so, the then 23-year-old Nesma underwent the exorcism. Her husband took a week off from work to watch over the procedure, and, of course, her in-laws also stayed at the couple's apartment. All of them there to make sure Nesma would drink the salt water, and unbeknownst to her and the people around her, poison herself with it. The hotja would also occasionally come by to pray and read her verses from the Quran. Because the salt water, as expected, didn't taste good, Nesma immediately wanted to stop. But the four managed to talk her back into it. But they could only persuade her so long, and after a few days they had to force the water down her throat. Nesma actually had a medical condition at this point, and her husband and her in-laws knew about this. She was suffering from a clotting disorder of her blood, a condition that would drastically be made worse by drinking salt water. This exorcism was kept a tight secret. Nesma's parents, who still lived in Lebanon, usually called their daughter at least once a day, but for the duration of the exorcism, no one answered their calls. There was only one person, outside of the four previously mentioned people, that was allowed to see Nesma. Her aunt, the only blood family who also lived in Berlin. She came to see her a day or two after the exorcism started, and she would later tell the court a harrowing tale. When she arrived at the apartment, Nesma had been unable to get up from the couch. She could barely speak, and when she did, she sounded drunk and incoherent. She was ghostly pale, and her movements were sluggish and uncontrolled. We will never know why her aunt didn't call for help right then and there. When she left, Nesma's fate was sealed. Her aunt was forbidden from visiting again, and her calls went unanswered, like those of Nesma's parents. Nesma's condition deteriorated with every hour, but yet no one got her help or stopped the exorcism. As they would later say in court, they thought if they called a doctor, everything would be for naught. because if someone outside of the family knew of the exorcism, it wouldn't work. All the while, Nesma's kidneys had stopped working completely. Her heart and brain were severely damaged by the natrium that was poisoning her. In her last days, Nesma could recognize neither her husband nor her in-laws. She fell off the couch multiple times and had to be carried to the bathroom or she would soil herself. On the morning of the 7th of December, Nesma's husband and her father-in-law decided to force one more bottle of salt water down her throat. Even though forensics were never sure how much salt was in the last bottle of water, their best estimate was at least 64 grams or 2.25 ounces of pure salt. A few hours after that, Nesma's body gave up its fight. Her husband Washti called emergency services, and even though it took the doctors only 4 minutes to arrive at the apartment, Nesma had already stopped breathing. Washti went with Nesma to the hospital, but at no point did he ever mention the salt water. The doctors in the hospital actually managed to bring Nesma back 2 times, until her heart finally stopped in the evening of the 7th of December. An autopsy was conducted because of her young age. As it would turn out, Nesma died from a double lung emboly caused by a blood clot in her leg and a brain edema. The salt amount in her body at the time of her death was 10 times higher than that of a healthy woman of her age. Even though after the autopsy it became very apparent that Nesma had been poisoned with salt water, it would take 4 years for the prosecution to bring charges to the Hodja, Nesma's parents-in-law, and her husband. The reason for that is a law that exists in Germany. A law that promises religious freedom and to be able to exercise this freedom however you want. Now, even though this law can be problematic, as we see here now, it does have a very good reason for existing, and I don't think I need to explain to you why. The prosecution didn't have to prove that Nesma died from natrium poisoning. They had to prove that Nesma wasn't a willing participant. 2 experts were called. The first one told the court that the amount of salt water that got forced into Nesma was equal to hitting someone on the head with a sledgehammer. The second expert called was Professor Pontus Pearson. He was the director of vegetative physiology at the Charité, the same hospital Nesma died in. He called into question Nesma's in-law's story that Nesma willingly poisoned herself with the salt water. He described the body's survival instinct, which at some point would have stopped Nesma from drinking the salt water. And seeing as Nesma had bruises all over her body that suggested she had been held down, this seemed very likely. To illustrate this, he described an experiment that was conducted on the prisoners of the concentration camp at Dachau. The prisoners were forced to drink salt water. The doctors at the camp told the prisoners if they protested, they would be tortured. Nonetheless, at some point they started struggling so much against having to drink the liquid that they had to be strapped down, and the water was forced down their throats. But they still continued to fight against it. Until one night some of them got loose and fought over a dirty cleaning mop just to get some fresh water. This harrowing tale illustrated to the court pretty clearly that Nesma at some point must have stopped drinking the water willingly. And even if she had drank it willingly, however unlikely that is, the family must have noticed that she was getting sicker and sicker with each day. But none of them ever got her help. In the end, the Hodja only had to pay 3,000 euros and got 2 years of probation. Nesma's husband would go to prison for 3 years and 8 months. Her mother-in-law would go to prison for 2 years and 8 months. And his father would only get 2 years on probation. So tell me what you think. Was justice served? Did Nesma willingly participate, at least in the beginning? And who's really to blame? Religious superstition or the greed for a grandchild? Let me know your thoughts down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you again in my next video. Until then, stay safe.